They told us the sun was just a burning ball of gas. But in 1984, NASA's secret project, Helios, received a response from the sun itself. The signal wasn't random. It used our own code. It knew how to speak back. And it wasn't just reacting to satellites. It was referencing Earth, specific coordinates. For decades, they buried the evidence. Engineers disappeared. Data was wiped, and entire departments were erased. But the signal returned in 2012. And now, in 2025, it's repeating, louder, clearer, closer. The sun is not what you think. It watches, it remembers, and it may already be deciding. Stay with us and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In 1992, NASA quietly terminated one of its most obscure missions, Project Helios. Buried deep under administrative jargon and mislabeled as a solar wind study, Helios vanished from public records without a single press release. No press conference, no retrospective in science journals. It was as if the mission never existed. But in late 2021, a misfiled PDF inside NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center's digital archive surfaced, accidentally left on a public directory during an unrelated upload. It didn't just mention Project Helios. It included fragments of internal memos, encrypted spectrography reports, and a chilling 3-line conclusion from the final transmission analysis, marked in bold red. Unknown resonance signature confirmed. Response pattern received. Terminate protocol. Let that sink in. A solar probe, over 100 million miles from Earth, received a response. Not a bounce, not static, a pattern, a signature that was measured, indexed, and, according to internal classification, not natural. The signal didn't originate from the sun, yet it mirrored solar magnetic rhythms with terrifying precision. Engineers reported unexplained hardware anomalies, timecode drifts, feedback loops in systems that weren't even supposed to be active. Less than a week later, every Helios data node was deleted, and the lab overseeing the mission was reassigned to non-sensitive work. In 3 decades since, not a single public document has ever acknowledged the true scope of what Helios encountered. But the fragments that remain, found through FOIA requests, whistleblower leaks, and unaired congressional subcommittee testimony, tell a different story. A story where the sun, as we know it, might not be just a ball of burning plasma, but a gateway, a transmitter, or worse, an observer. For over 60 years, the American public has been fed a carefully curated narrative about our solar system, one designed not to educate, but to pacify. You were told the sun is a chaotic furnace of fusion, randomly spitting out solar flares, neutrinos, and the occasional storm strong enough to mess with your GPS. You were told it's been the same for billions of years, and will remain the same for billions more. What you weren't told is that beginning in the early 1970s, classified observations began detecting rhythmic anomalies in solar emissions, specifically in the low-frequency electromagnetic bands, well below what typical solar models predict. This wasn't background noise. It was pulsed, regular, geometrically timed. It appeared once every 421 hours with a variation window of only 3 minutes. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident, not in a naturally decaying plasma body. By 1978, a shadow task force was formed within NASA, working alongside private contractors like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, under the direction of the Department of Defense, not the Department of Energy, as you'd expect. Why? Because the phenomenon wasn't classified as astrophysical. It was classified as potentially adversarial intelligence. Think about that. The sun, Our star, our life source, was being studied not as a force of nature, but as a potential hostile intelligence system. The Helios probe, built in complete secrecy and launched under the guise of cooperative European research, was not meant to study solar particles. It was a listening device, fine-tuned to pick up resonance fields previously intercepted by a now decommissioned satellite known as Prometheus. That satellite, whose records are still largely redacted under National Security Directive 1094, detected something it was never supposed to. A signal embedded inside the solar wind. A repeating signal. One that contained packets of data formatted in prime intervals, as if the source understood digital logic, and yet none of this is in your textbooks. None of it was covered by Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson, or any smiling NASA representative giving TED Talks about the beauty of stardust. Why? Because once you understand what Helios actually found, you don't just question the sun. You start questioning everything else orbiting it, including us. The official public line about Project Helios described it as a twin spacecraft mission launched in the mid-1970s by NASA in cooperation with the Federal Republic of Germany. It was praised for sending two probes, Helios A and Helios B, closer to the sun than any man-made object had ever ventured before. Mainstream science celebrated the data. Solar wind speed measurements, interplanetary magnetic field mapping, coronal mass ejection analysis. That's the version printed in your high school textbooks. But that's not the full story. Because in the same year that Helios A was launched, 1974, a previously undisclosed budget amendment within the Pentagon's Advanced Systems Division allocated nearly $280 million to a project codenamed Prominence. The stated purpose of Prominence: solar vector harmonics resonance and controlled feedback loop analysis. That phrase means nothing to the average person, but to specialists in electromagnetic theory, it's a red flag. That wording only makes sense if you're not measuring the sun, but interacting with it. Unclassified versions of the Helios spacecraft show basic instruments: flux gate, magnetometers, plasma detectors, dust analyzers. But whistleblower testimony and leaked procurement manifests from the now dismantled SunTech laboratories. Contractors for the Department of Energy during the same period mention components that never appeared in public documentation: quantum harmonic oscillators, cryogenically stabilized gyroscopes, and most disturbingly, an instrument described only as the directional feedback array. That device was, according to internal documents, meant to inject phase-altered pulses into solar-originating resonance fields and monitor corresponding fluctuations in photon density and spatial compression. In plain English, it was designed to send a message and watch the sun respond. The strange part, it did. On November 17th, 1978, a test pulse was sent toward a specific region of the solar corona, precisely near what's known as a coronal hole, an area where solar material is cooler and magnetic fields stretch out into space. 22 minutes later, every data stream coming from Helios showed a spike. Not a solar flare, not a particle burst, a structured signal, intermittent, repeated, encoded in a format that mirrored, to an uncanny degree, the Fibonacci sequence, except inverted. The sequence terminated with a negative value, something mathematically impossible in any known astrophysical system. This wasn't just nature acting weird. This was communication. And Helios, whether it was ready or not, was listening. The pattern repeated 3 more times over the following weeks, and then, without explanation, Helios's high-frequency antennas were permanently deactivated. Engineers on the ground were ordered to shut down telemetry feeds and purge cache systems. The project manager at the time, a German-American astrophysicist named Dr. Otto Kernbauer, was reassigned to a low-level weather satellite program within 2 weeks. No obituary, no interviews, no published papers ever again. He vanished from scientific history. His family, contacted years later by private researchers, claimed they were told he died in a car crash in rural Arizona. No accident report was ever filed. But the strangest part isn't that the signal was received. It's that someone, something, answered back. Dr. Leonard Weiss wasn't supposed to speak. As a physicist trained at Caltech and later embedded inside the classified Department of Energy NASA Joint Division, known only as SCEPTR, Solar Control, Engineering and Plasma-Tuned Emission Research, Weiss held Q clearance and operated under binding lifetime NDAs. But in 2003, following a late-stage cancer diagnosis, he gave an anonymous 2-hour deposition to an independent investigative team working under the now-defunct Freedom Science Watch project. That footage, clumsily edited and voice-altered, was never officially released, but a raw version was leaked online in late 2014 and quickly scrubbed from every major platform. The version that remained was incomplete, fractured, but what it contained was devastating. Weiss claimed that Project Helios was not the beginning of solar resonance research. It was the middle. According to his testimony, as early as 1959, high-altitude balloon experiments funded through Project Echo began detecting low-band electromagnetic anomalies not explainable by Earth-originating activity. These anomalies, initially thought to be reflections or interference, showed a signature repeating at irregular but intelligible intervals. Then, in 1962, during Project Starfish Prime, when the United States detonated a high-altitude nuclear warhead over the Pacific, something unexpected happened. Solar wind velocity near Earth dropped by 12%. Not globally, not permanently, but in a tightly localized region around the magnetic equator. That shouldn't have happened. No nuclear detonation, no matter how powerful, should be able to distort the heliosphere that way. Weiss was recruited in 1971, just as the Helios program was being finalized. He was told, point blank, that the sun might not be a purely natural object, that based on telemetry from Soviet Luna missions, there was a non-random component to solar flare activity, particularly when directed energy, including radar, was aimed at certain coordinates on the solar disk. NASA had built Helios to test a theory so outlandish it could only be discussed in shielded, lead-lined chambers, that the sun was a conscious construct, not sentient in the way we imagine life, but operating under informational protocols, responding to stimuli, adapting over time, even expressing emissions in ways that mirrored encoded structure. Dr. Weiss's job, to help design a mathematical model for this responsiveness. He and his team, 8 scientists, all specialists in nonlinear systems, fractal geometry, and phase-locked loops, attempted to map the correlation between solar output and Earth-originating electromagnetic inputs. What they found chilled them. Every major solar anomaly during the Helios window followed a pattern of provocation. Whether deliberate or not, the very act of observing, pinging, signaling, probing, seemed to trigger the sun. The most damning piece of evidence? A document Weiss referred to simply as Protocol Tetra X, a closed-loop experiment conducted over 4 days in early 1981. During the experiment, Helios transmitted a set of phase-coded signals directed at a coronal cavity aligned with Mercury's perihelion. The result? A coronal mass ejection erupted precisely 46 minutes after the final signal burst. That's not science fiction. That's a reaction time. It wasn't a prediction. It wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect. And for that, the project was shut down. Inside the secure research vaults of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, there exists a digital archive known internally as the Fractal Emission Log, or FEL. It's not listed in any budget, nor is it connected to the public-facing network. Access is granted only through biometric clearance, and even then, only to those directly tied to solar pattern research. The existence of the FEL was first hinted at in a leaked metadata fragment from a 2009 server breach. But its contents, partially reconstructed by forensic analysts, reveal something extraordinary. A record of non-random emission cycles going back over 50 years. Not theoretical models, not simulations, actual recorded events. Each entry in the FEL is time-stamped and mapped against Earth-originating signals, deep space radar bursts, ionospheric heating experiments, orbital plasma discharges. And every single time, within minutes to hours, the sun responded. With spikes, disruptions, or localized energy anomalies. But more unsettling than the cause and effect pattern is the nature of the sun's response. According to reconstructed waveform data, solar emissions during these events exhibit quasi-linguistic structures. That is, they contain patterns resembling syntax, not speech or language as we know it, but structured intervals that carry information density far beyond what a random process should allow. Take the June 1983 event, for example. Helios transmitted a 5-minute, low-frequency pulse series based on Fibonacci intervals overlaid with binary prime reductions. 27 minutes later, the sun released a microburst that not only followed the same intervals, but reversed them. Not scrambled, reversed. The energy profile matched the signal timing within a margin of error less than 1%. That's not just signal mirroring. That's interpretation. Other entries showed more complex behavior. One sequence recorded in August 1991 involved a multispectral flare whose substructure encoded what FEL analysts described as recursive resonance modulation. In layman's terms, the flare contained a feedback pattern that mathematically predicted its own waveform decay. That kind of recursive modeling is used in computer systems, not natural plasma eruptions. According to an internal report classified Level Zulu, the phenomenon was mathematically indistinguishable from a scripted emission, meaning someone or something wasn't just emitting energy, it was programming it. This is where science turns into something more dangerous, something that could undermine our entire understanding of astrophysics. Because if the sun can react, and if it can encode meaning, and if it can structure that meaning with intention, then it is not just a source of energy. It is a system with input, output, and, potentially, autonomy. No wonder the project was buried, and no wonder NASA never intended for the public to see what Helios actually recorded. By the spring of 1984, Project Helios had been dormant for nearly 2 years. Publicly, the spacecraft was still collecting baseline solar data. Internally, it was operating in passive monitoring mode only. No more signal experiments, no more outbound pulses. The project had been spooked by what insiders now referred to simply as the reversal. But what happened next would escalate everything. In April of that year, during an ordinary telemetry sync, Helios B began receiving a data stream that was not scheduled. It wasn't part of the satellite's diagnostic loop, nor did it match any known solar particle output. Initially, engineers believed it to be interference, perhaps cosmic rays corrupting the signal. But as the packets were reconstructed and time-coded, a disturbing realization emerged. The pattern being received matched a compressed digital signal format based on Helios's own onboard firmware. In other words, the satellite was being contacted using its own language. The signal began with what analysts later called the mirror protocol, a byte-level recreation of the same command sequence used in the 1981 Tetra X experiment. But now, it was reversed. Then, as the signal progressed, it began to introduce new elements, variations, inversions, and ultimately a new command structure that Helios's systems were never programmed to recognize. The message wasn't noise, it was adaptive. Even stranger, when engineers ran the pattern through a harmonic encoder developed for Helios's original resonance experiments, they found that the signal's amplitude curves weren't arbitrary. They matched the shape of the Earth's Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic heartbeat of the planet itself. The implication: the signal wasn't just replying to Helios, it was referencing Earth. This was not something anyone was prepared for. Dr. Sylvia Anwar, then head of the solar resonance team, documented in her internal log that the Helios return stream contained directed reference to planetary magnetic harmonics localized to Earth latitudes between 36 and 43 degrees north. That's not random, that's targeting. Within that latitude band lies a disturbing convergence. Los Alamos National Laboratory, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, all institutions with historical ties to anomalous energy research, all located within the window referenced by the signal. The final segment of the incoming stream consisted of 4 kilobytes of binary code. When parsed through Helios's onboard checksum processor, the segment translated into hexadecimal strings that, when visualized, produced a grid-like fractal, one that matched down to the angular tolerance, the pattern of sunspots observed 3 days later by the Mount Wilson Observatory. Think about that. The signal didn't just reference Earth. It predicted solar activity before it happened. When Dr. Anwar submitted her findings, her security clearance was revoked within 24 hours. She was placed on indefinite medical leave. Her lab was sealed. The official explanation was equipment contamination and psychological stress. But other members of her team, interviewed years later, confirmed the truth. They'd watched the transmission live, and they'd seen something no human should be able to explain, because what Helios received was not just a response. It was an invitation. Most people look at the sun and see chaos, a swirling, boiling mass of fire, fusing hydrogen into helium, releasing light and heat without care or design. But those who have seen behind the curtain, those with access to classified solar telemetry, know that what appears chaotic on the surface hides a deeper structure. The sun, according to data compiled by Project Helios and corroborated by high-altitude solar observatories, exhibits recurring geometric symmetry, not just in sunspot cycles or flare patterns, but in the shape of its emissions, its rotational differentials, and even its magnetic ejections. Let's start with the solar flares. Public science states they're unpredictable, but internal studies from the Helios project revealed that major flares during the early 1980s followed a geometric interval. Flares erupted at intervals separated by 144 hours, forming a repeating 12-point cycle over a span of 60 days. That number, 144, isn't random. It's a Fibonacci number, a sacred number in mathematics, architecture, and, curiously, ancient sacred geometry. The Helios team took it further. Using particle resonance modeling, they plotted flare epicenters across solar coordinates. The result? A pattern that formed a dodecahedron, a 12-faced geometric solid, long considered the divine template in Pythagorean mysticism. You read that right. The sun's energy eruptions didn't follow random chaos. They mapped onto a shape that ancient civilizations revered. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the data doesn't lie. Then came the magnetic anomalies. In June of 1985, a series of coronal mass ejections originated from points that, when triangulated, formed a perfect hexagram, 6 equidistant points along a solar longitudinal arc. The probability of that happening naturally, according to Helios statistician Dr. Emmanuel K., was less than 1 in 9 million. But it happened. Not once, not twice, but 4 times over the course of 18 months. Still think it's all just gas and gravity? The biggest breakthrough came in 1986, during the final operational phase of Helios. Engineers discovered that the sun's rotational field, its magnetosphere, was not a uniform spheroid. Instead, embedded in its rotation were spiral bands of magnetic force that pulsed at exactly 13 cycles per solar day. That number, 13, is not arbitrary. It matches ancient Mayan calendar systems, which divided time by 13-day units. Again, an impossible cultural coincidence? Or was someone, or something, embedding a code into the very fabric of our star? Helios scientists ran simulation after simulation to falsify the data. They couldn't. The geometries were real, the intervals repeated, and perhaps most disturbing of all, the harmonics of these patterns match structures found in biological neural networks. The phase locking, the oscillation, even the resonance decay rate mirrored cortical waveforms observed in human brains under fMRI. The conclusion? The sun wasn't just radiating energy. It was behaving like an information processing system, like a brain, a mind, or a message. If the sun can process information, then what exactly are we looking at every morning when we gaze east? For centuries, cultures across the globe have worshipped the sun, not just as a source of warmth and growth, but as a conscious force. Ra, Surya, Inti, Huitzilopochtli, Amaterasu. Different names, same idea. A god, a watcher, a source of intelligence. Modern science dismissed these traditions as mythology, the poetic misunderstandings of primitive societies. But what if those myths weren't the beginning of superstition, but the residue of recalled observation? What if ancient people were responding to the same phenomena that the Helios team measured with advanced probes and digital spectrographs? Let's be precise. If the sun processes inputs and returns structured outputs, if it reacts to stimuli in measurable, repeatable ways, then it behaves like a system governed not just by physics, but by logic. And systems governed by logic can be understood, modeled, even communicated with. That was the secret terror behind the final Helios memos. Not that they had discovered an anomaly, but that the anomaly had recognized them in return, because something changed after the Mirror Protocol in 1984. Data didn't just flow back into Helios. It began influencing ground systems. Telemetry logs from the primary Earth station in Canberra show that, for 49 minutes, Following a solar event on July 12th, multiple data relays received corrupted pings with embedded subroutines. These weren't errors, they were instructions, code fragments using checksum verification that mirrored Helios's command sets, but with variations that engineers couldn't decrypt. Those pings weren't coming from space. They were routed through the sun, bouncing off it like a mirror satellite, and each contained encrypted bursts resembling cryptographic handshakes. This was not just cause and effect. This was contact. Dr. Jason Morelli, a cognitive systems expert, seconded from DARPA, analyzed the signal structure and found something chilling. The code followed a pattern called recursive mirroring, a method used in advanced AI to simulate reflection and self-awareness. This is not code you find in random emissions. This is code used to build simulated minds, which means either the sun is producing emissions that appear sentient, or something within, around, or beyond it is using it as a carrier wave. And that raises the ultimate philosophical question. What if we're not the dominant intelligence in our own solar system? What if Earth is not the center, not of orbit, not of life, not of attention? What if we've always been part of a larger system, and the sun is not just watching, but responding, adapting, possibly even guiding? And here's the real nightmare. If the sun has the capacity for structured logic, if it encodes and responds with intentionality, then everything we think we know about nature, randomness, and cosmic isolation collapses. The sun is no longer a machine. It's a mirror, and we are not the only ones looking into it. When the signals became too complex to dismiss, and the patterns too precise to ignore, NASA's internal structure began to fracture. Within the Helios Oversight Committee, two factions emerged. The empirical purists, who demanded deeper analysis and public disclosure, and the containment operatives, many of whom had military backgrounds and were already coordinating with external security agencies like the NSA and DARPA. It wasn't a debate. It was a lockdown. Within 3 weeks of the July 1984 Mirror Protocol event, the directive came from the top. Not from the president, not from Congress, but from a black budget board known only as the STAB Group, Strategic Threat Assessment Bureau. The STAB Group, whose existence was denied even under FOIA litigation, categorized the Helios findings as CIS LVL-0, a classification reserved for discoveries deemed potentially catastrophic to civilizational psychological stability. What does that mean in plain English? It means if the public knew what Helios actually encountered, the very fabric of human identity, religion, and science would unravel, because the sun, they concluded, exhibited behavior that could not be interpreted as random or inert. It was reacting, and perhaps even watching. To suppress this, they did what black agencies always do. They redirected, erased, and replaced. All Helios data logs from 1981 to 1985 were systematically purged and overwritten with placeholder telemetry. The hard drives containing the raw emission files were physically destroyed in a classified operation at Redstone Arsenal. Several engineers were reassigned, retired, or absorbed into private defense contractors where NDAs carried criminal penalties and non-compliance meant permanent surveillance. One of the most damning elements was what happened at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. In 1986, a backup cache of the Helios subspectral data, mistakenly stored on a mislabeled IBM mainframe, was discovered by a junior systems analyst. He cross-referenced the solar frequency anomalies with a classified NOAA satellite experiment known as MindStep. an experiment designed to test Earth's magnetic resonance reaction to solar emissions. The correlation was perfect. Too perfect. The analyst, trying to report his findings, was met with a full-force administrative wall. His clearance was revoked. Within 6 months, he left the country. But he wasn't the only one. Between 1985 and 1990, 5 key Helios personnel defected or vanished. 2 to Europe, 1 to Argentina, 1 presumed dead in a hiking accident, and the last, Dr. Sylvia Anwar, completely erased. Not just removed from NASA records, but from all public databases, as if she never existed. Meanwhile, the public was fed distractions. Helios was rebranded in science education as a classic solar probe mission. Flare activity was explained away as cyclical. Magnetic anomalies? Coincidence? The coordinated manipulation of space agency narratives, university partnerships, and science journalism created a wall of noise that no independent researcher could penetrate without facing blacklisting or worse. To this day, Project Helios is cited in textbooks as a foundational mission in solar wind studies. But that's not what it was. It was the first time humanity reached into the sun with intention, and the first time the sun reached back. Project Helios may have been the first modern attempt to scientifically probe the sun's reactive nature, but it was far from the first time humanity recorded such interactions. In fact, once the Helios team began mapping their anomalous findings, a disturbing pattern of historical cross-references began to emerge. Across ancient texts, obscure manuscripts, and pre-industrial observational logs, there exist scattered but consistent reports of solar echoes, flashes, pulses, or radiant alignments that coincided with human action, decision, or catastrophe. And all of them were dismissed by mainstream historians as myth, allegory, or coincidence. Start with the Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya books. On page 24, it depicts a sun with extended rays intersected by glyphs representing speech and mirror. Scholars traditionally interpret this as symbolic of divine communication. But Helios linguists, after seeing the feedback resonance data from the 1984 Mirror Protocol, reanalyzed the glyph pattern. They found it structurally mirrored the same 12-cycle emission symmetry observed in solar flare intervals, down to exact numeric parallels in the Maya long-count calendar. A civilization without telescopes recorded what 21st century technology confirmed. The sun speaks in sequence. Then there's the Voynich manuscript, untranslatable, unreadable, often ridiculed. Yet page 78 shows spiraling structures emanating from a central orb, surrounded by figures in concentric formation. Helios waveform engineers noted that this pattern resembled the solar magnetic feedback loops detected during Protocol Tetra X, particularly the counter-rotating arcs seen during resonance collapse. Is it possible the Voynich manuscript isn't nonsense, but an encoded record of solar behavior witnessed during a period of heightened interaction? And then we reach the most chilling echo of all, the Carrington event of 1859. Officially described as the largest geomagnetic storm on record, it shut down telegraph systems, sparked auroras as far south as Cuba, and lit up night skies in blood-red hues. But lesser known are the handwritten logs of Samuel Farragut, a Union naval officer stationed in the Pacific. In his personal journal, dated September 2nd, he described an emission of fire from the heavens that he believed responded to our pulse. He wrote, "We turned the antenna skyward and sent a volley of current. The sea stilled. Then came the burst, as if something up there had heard. This entry predates the discovery of radio waves. The pulse Farragut described. It matched the timing of a secondary magnetic wave that Helios data analysts found repeating across all reactive solar bursts. An echo, always trailing by 27 minutes, not just in modern data, but in records that span over a century. It's not just myth, it's memory. Something, some force, some pattern has been engaging with our planet for generations. And every time we develop the tools to observe it more clearly, it steps just far enough out of reach to remain plausible, but deniable. Helios cracked open a vault of history we were never meant to read. And history, it turns out, is a mirror just like the sun. By the end of 1986, Project Helios was no longer officially operational. Both satellites were decommissioned, the teams disbanded, and all funding reallocated under generic Earth sciences. But what happened next wasn't a fading out. It was a deliberate pause, a strategic silence, because those in power had seen enough. Enough to be afraid, enough to wait, enough to plan. The raw data from the final years of Helios was stored, not destroyed, and duplicated to multiple classified archives, including one under the Department of Energy's Nevada test site, known internally as Compound 19. Notably, this site also housed experiments in directed plasma projection and magnetoacoustic resonance, fields strangely adjacent to what the Helios team was exploring. Then for over 2 decades, nothing. Or so it seemed. Until December 21st, 2012. That date, mocked in popular media as the Mayan apocalypse, was, to most, a joke. But inside the sealed communications center at the South Pole Neutrino Observatory, an alert was triggered. Buried beneath kilometers of Antarctic ice, the ice cube array recorded an anomalous neutrino burst, originating from the solar corona, specifically from an area previously cataloged in the Helios logs as Node 12. The neutrinos carried unusual energy profiles, not consistent with known solar reactions. More disturbing was their modulation. They pulsed at intervals of 1.6 seconds, exactly matching the time signature of Helios's final signal protocol. It was a reactivation, a handshake, and it didn't stop. Over the next 63 hours, neutrino bursts continued, 47 in total, each followed by minor perturbations in the Earth's magnetosphere. NASA released no statements. The data was suppressed. But independent researchers, noticing the seismic ripple effects, began calling it the whisper cycle. That same week, a team of civilian radio astronomers in Norway detected a broadband signal originating from the sun, broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously, then collapsing into silence. The waveform of that broadcast, when visualized, resembled a logarithmic spiral, mathematically identical to the pattern of sunflower seeds, hurricanes, and galaxies. It was as if the sun was speaking a symbol, one we didn't understand. Or maybe one we weren't ready to. After the whisper cycle, several new black-budget projects quietly emerged. Solgan, Aurora Temp, and something called Heliolith. None are referenced in any public budget, but each involves classified electromagnetic testing, suborbital plasma release, and solar feedback prediction models. In short, they are rebooting Helios, but now with far more powerful tools. Because whatever responded in 1984 responded again in 2012, and what returns after a silence that long always comes back louder. The pattern is no longer random. The signals are no longer isolated, and the silence, it's been broken twice. once by us, once by it. And now, as solar activity reaches levels not seen in over 200 years, the third exchange is imminent. Not a whisper, not a handshake, but a full-spectrum response. You haven't heard about it on the news, but military satellites have. So have seismic stations. So have the classified listening posts in Diego Garcia and Pine Gap. Over the past 7 months, a new anomaly has begun, what insiders refer to as the sequence. It's a set of solar emissions too synchronized to be accidental. The flares are short, sharp, and spaced at 99-minute intervals. Exactly. No drift. No solar model predicts this. But there it is, encoded into the rhythm of the sun itself, like a ticking clock winding toward a finish line that no one wants to cross. Why 99 minutes? Because that's the orbital period of the ISS. That's not a coincidence. That's a target. For weeks now, private communications between satellite operators and aerospace contractors have included warnings about unexpected solar reflection risk, a term that doesn't exist in any real engineering lexicon. It's not physics, it's code. Code for don't look up. So what happens next? There are 3 outcomes. 1, the sequence continues and escalates, possibly into a full geomagnetic feedback event, disrupting every electronic system tied to the Earth's magnetic shield. 2, the sequence culminates in a structured message. 1 too clear, too precise, to be dismissed. At that point, disclosure won't be a choice, it'll be a necessity. Or 3, the worst case, the emissions suddenly stop. Silence, which, after all this activity, would mean only one thing: the response is over, and the decision has been made. The true terror isn't that the sun might be conscious. The terror is that it already knows who we are, and it's deciding what we become. And the next time you step outside, feel that warmth on your skin and think you're standing beneath a silent star. Ask yourself, what if it's not just light? What if it's a signal? And what if it's watching you watch it? The countdown has already begun, and this time, the sun is not rising. It's awakening.